How would you define creativity?
We can look at creativity from a number of different perspectives. We can look at the individual characteristics. We can look at the environment. We can look at mental processes that people use to be creative. But the single simplest and best way to understand creativity is to look at a creative product, whether it's an engineering structure, an artwork, anything. We judge it by these two qualities. Is it new, and does it do what it's supposed to do?
The word creativity gets abused a lot because just anything new, it's just so easy. The minute you seriously think about the effectiveness, then so many things wouldn't be called creative anymore. Let's move to dark creativity.
It's recognizing that you can choose to do bad things with creativity just the same as you can choose to do good things. And some people do that. The future of work is with more and more automation. It means that the more valuable skills now are soft skills like creativity. And if you're not preparing kids for that, those kids, they may find they can't get a job because they're very good at mathematics, but computers do maths now.
For years, people predicted that artificial intelligence would take over the routine jobs first, and that creativity would be the last human stronghold. What has actually happened is almost the reverse. AI is generating art, music, writing at scale, while the frontier of scientific and mathematical discovery remains stubbornly human. My guest today has a precise explanation for why, grounded in mathematics. David Cropley is professor of engineering innovation at Adelaide University and one of the world's leading experts on creativity and innovation. He came to the field through engineering and before that, through 4 years of service in the UK's Royal Navy. He is the author and co-author of 8 books and over 150 papers on creativity and innovation. His work asks us to think carefully about what creativity actually is, what it requires, and what we risk losing if we confuse statistical sophistication with genuine creative thought. Enjoy today's episode. Welcome to the Creativity Dialogues, Dr. David. Such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
In creativity research, novelty tends to get all the attention. We celebrate the unexpected, the disruptive, the rule-breaking. But you make a quieter and perhaps more radical argument that a truly creative product must do something in the world, that it must solve a problem, meet a need, or open up a possibility that didn't exist before. Can you
That's right.
shed a little light on that?
Yeah, so I think creativity researchers for a long time have understood that creativity is not just novelty alone. But it's a very important point because I think in society more broadly, people tend to associate just novelty with creativity. And just because you do something different doesn't mean that it's good or worthwhile or solves a problem like you mentioned. So particularly in the last maybe 15 or so years in creativity research, there is a much stronger emphasis on the fact that creativity has to be a combination of both novelty or newness as well as effectiveness. And both of those go by several different names. But at the core, it's this idea that for something to be truly creative, it must be both new, original, novel, but also it has to be relevant, it has to solve a problem, it has to do something useful. And where I think that challenges people sometimes is they say, well, that's obvious in something like engineering, but what about in the arts? What about in music or theater or film? What do you mean by effectiveness? My argument is always it's exactly the same when we understand novelty, and effectiveness is also present in artistic pursuits, artistic creativity as well. But it's very important because otherwise you can end up with just crazy ideas that are different, but just being different and unusual doesn't make it creative.
Absolutely. I always wonder that the way the common man perceives creativity, he always seems focused on the newness, on the novelty. That, oh, is there something new? Why do you think that there's this general perception in the in the average person that
Yeah.
creativity is just it's something new get created? How come the message that creativity has two aspects to it, the way it stands now, of both novelty, newness, and usefulness or value. How come the value, the usefulness, the effectiveness, how come this point always gets ignored?
Well, I think probably because the newness element of creativity is the bit that kind of impresses us more when you see an artist paint a picture, in a different style, or somebody, sing a new song, or even just reinterpret a song in a new way. And even in again in disciplines like engineering, when we see, a completely new type of building design or something like that, we tend to be sort of excited by and impressed by the originality, the newness element. And I think a lot of us probably we take the effectiveness for granted because again in engineering, of course we expect the building to not fall down or the bridge to be able to support traffic, and of course when performers sing a song or an artist paints a picture, we take it for granted that they do a good job and they sing in tune and things like that. So I think it's just a human tendency to we take the effectiveness for granted because it's kind of a given, and the thing that's more interesting and exciting that captures our attention is the newness. So I think that's it's a kind of innocent explanation. In a way,
Right.
it's humans notice things that are different, and that's the thing that kind of captures our attention.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I also feel that it's thanks to that the word creativity gets abused a lot because just anything new, it's just so easy if that's the only criteria to just say
Yeah,
anything is creative. The minute you seriously think about the effectiveness, then so many things wouldn't be called creative anymore. So I
yeah,
think that
exactly.
this is a real problem in that if the understanding isn't really made evident, this leads to a lot of the myths that surround creativity.
Yeah, and I think it sometimes devalues things that are also genuinely creative because we notice things that are different, but they're not necessarily effective at what they do, but they get a lot of attention just by being different. And then somebody else who's doing something that is both effective and novel doesn't necessarily always get the same acclaim and the same attention. So you're right. I mean, it's a problem in the sense that it kind of takes our attention away from things that I think really are genuinely creative, and tends to overvalue difference just for the sake of difference.
Absolutely. How would you define creativity?
So I think we've already really given the definition, and that is that the complex thing about it is that we can look at creativity from a number of different perspectives. We can look at the individual characteristics that creative people have. We can look at the environment in which people are being creative. We can look at the mental processes that people use to be creative. But the single simplest and best way to understand creativity is to look at the things that people do, the products or the outcomes that result. And as I said, we've already defined that because when you look at a creative product, and whether it's an engineering structure, an artwork, anything, we fundamentally judge it by these two qualities: novelty and effectiveness. So is it new or different or original, and does it do what it's supposed to do? And those are the two core criteria for judging a creative product. And as I said, looking at products is probably the single best way to understand creativity.
Mhm. Why does the product hold the most significance to you?
Well, because all of the other elements I mentioned, the personal characteristics, the mental processes, the environment, to me, those are just the means to an end, whereas the product is the end. So, no matter what happens with how you think, how you behave, how you feel, and so on, at the end of the day, you either generate a product that is creative or it's not creative. So those other factors are important contributing factors, but at the end of the day, the single clearest indication of creativity is have you developed something that meets these criteria for being creative. So that's why I think it's, if you strip away everything else, if you want to know if somebody is creative, the single best way is to ask them to do something that requires creativity and then look at the thing they've done. And it doesn't matter if they have a favorable personality or if they're good at generating ideas. The best test at the end of the day is, did they make something creative? So that's why I think it's kind of in amongst a cluster of things that are important. I think product is the most important way of looking at creativity.
Did you ever meet a practitioner, a creator, whose work made you revise something in your own theory?
I'm going to say no, and I know that sounds a bit arrogant, but it's not meant to be. I think it just shows that I think creativity research, the science of creativity, has focused on the right things. And again, we see creative products. I think what you sometimes see is maybe a product that shows its creativity in an unusual way. So I don't know. Take a painting, for example. We've got lots of examples throughout history of creative artists, creative paintings, but every so often you see a particular way that an artist has demonstrated their creativity that itself is creative. Jackson Pollock, for example, the first time people started dripping paint on a canvas and so on, that was a radically new idea. So sometimes the creativity sort of shows us there's always another way that you can be creative. And that's, it's not that they redefine the definition, it's that they simply show that there's always another way that you can demonstrate effectiveness and novelty. And that's kind of interesting to see.
The field has settled on novelty and effectiveness as these two requirements. How do you think it arrived at that?
That's actually a good question, because I've been doing research in this area myself, and so it's a tricky question, because I think, well, how did I mean, I read what other people have said, but obviously I've queried that myself. Um, I think, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about the history, that from the very beginning of what we call the modern creativity era, which started in about 1950 with psychologists beginning to study creativity, very early on in that modern era, the sort of founding scientists understood that creativity in products was something to do with how new it is, but also what we now call effectiveness. So that's kind of been present in the science of creativity really since the beginning. And I think, if you traced further back, I think it's that people have always understood that, that it's what we described before, that it's not just doing something different, but things have to be effective. But from this modern era, very early on, we had this idea of novelty and effectiveness, even if they called it something slightly different. And that maybe the better way to describe this is that survived, the test of time, that over 75 years of research, that has solidified. So the research that people have done has kind of backed that up. Some of my own research has looked at that, and looked, for example, at people. We've asked people to judge the creativity of certain products, and we've also asked them to score that creativity, to break it down more in terms of things like novelty and effectiveness. And we can see a statistical relationship between creativity as a single concept and those more detailed variables. So that kind of provides statistical evidence that that's what seems to be going on in people's heads when they judge creativity, is that they're looking for a combination of novelty and effectiveness. So exactly how that definition began, it's hard to say, but
Mhm.
research has backed up that it seems to be the right set of criteria.
When you say a product is effective, what exactly do you mean? Effective for who?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and again, always gets a little bit of debate. Um, in some disciplines, some domains, it's easier probably to judge that than others. It's certainly, again, in engineering, in my discipline, it's quite easy to judge effectiveness because if you're building a new car or a bridge or a building, we have very set criteria that determine whether or not that product does what it's supposed to do. So, as I said before, if you build a bridge, and one of the criteria for a bridge is that it's got to be able to support a certain weight, things like that, that's very easy to measure. And that's the effectiveness. Does it do what it's supposed to do? People sometimes say to me, but how do you judge that in the case of a work of art? What's the effectiveness there? I've always taken the line that it's exactly the same. It's does it do what it's supposed to do? The difference is that question, it's not now an easily sort of objectively measurable thing, but a painting doing what it's supposed to do is, does it communicate an emotion to the person looking at it? Or does it tell a story? Or does it accurately represent a scene? So fundamentally, I think the criteria of effectiveness is basically the same. It's still, does it do what it's supposed to do? But in the case of things like artistic products, you have to understand what doing what it's supposed to do means. And like I said, in the case of a picture, it might be conveying an emotion or things like that. So the criterion is a little bit more fuzzy, but it's still, I think, perfectly understandable of what we mean by effectiveness.
Newton and Leibniz both discovered calculus. Would you consider both to be creative?
I think so, and if I remember correctly, they discovered it independently, didn't they?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I think it's just one of those rare cases where two people came up with the same idea almost simultaneously, and of course they both benefited from the same background knowledge that had been developed and led up to that. But I
Mhm.
think if you were judging the creativity of that, you'd have to give them equal credit. And again, remembering that if we're judging the creativity of calculus as the product, we can almost separate that from the person. So the calculus at the time was a creative product. It was novel and it was effective. You can then say, well, what about the people who developed it? Were they creative? And I think if a person develops a creative product, then you can say that that person has some level of creativity. And if they both came up with the idea independently, then they're both creative to some degree as well.
When we look at the four C's, right from the mini C, the small C, the pro C, and the big C, do you feel that's a good way to evaluate creativity? Do you feel we should hold on to all of those four? Are some not really effective, or do they misread the idea of what creativity really is?
No, it's a good framework, and in fact, I'm in the middle of writing a chapter, kind of putting my thoughts on a new perspective on the four C's. It's a book by James
Ah,
Kaufman and Ron Beghetto,
yes.
who developed the original theory, but they're getting people like me to sort of, you know, give our thoughts on that. And the reason they developed the four C's in the first place was that prior to that there was just little C and big C, so just two categories. And the problem with that is that big C is basically, eminent, famous
Yeah.
creativity. And if you only have one other category, then it means everything else gets lumped into little c. But that's kind of unfair because that doesn't differentiate between a 5-year-old child learning to tie their shoelace by themselves and inventing a bow, and it doesn't differentiate between them and, for example, a professional writer who's not big C, they're not famous, but they're a competent professional creative writer. So James and Ron developed the four C's to kind of give a richer set of categories. And I think, I mean, you can argue a little bit about, you know, maybe you need a couple of additional levels, but I think it's a much better framework because Mini C is basically focused on children in a sort of more educational setting, learning about the world for the first time. Little C then captures older children through to adults who are just doing slightly creative everyday kinds of things. Pro C allows for this category of professionals in particular domains, singers, artists, writers, and so on, who aren't famous but are still doing creative things at a kind of higher level. And then Big C still allows for this sort of famous level, eminent level creativity. But so I think the four C's is a better structure, and it also helps to sort of explain some of the development of creativity that many people go through from childhood into sort of say professional level creativity. So I think it's a pretty useful, solid, helpful framework.
Right, because I've always wondered about how there are so many conflicting ideas about creativity. Because when we talk about the little C or the mini C, I'm glad that you put it down to children because then it's different. But if we compare it to what Csikszentmihalyi says about the systems model, where he
Yeah.
talks about the domain, that he says that creativity begins when you cross that threshold. So if we talk about the mini C or the little c, they're nowhere close to even crossing the threshold unless we're just comparing it to children. And so personally, I've always never really felt comfortable with the little c and mini
Good.
c because I feel that if everybody is going to be included, then we need to perhaps have a different word because we have to set some standards of what
Yeah.
creativity would be if we just decide let's include everybody. It would be unfair if we are comparing, a pro C or a big C, and then say never mind, we'll keep everyone happy. We'll have a
No.
little C, a mini C, and so personally for me, somehow that never really sort of worked. But I get the idea that there's so many perspectives, and
Well, I think you're right, but for me, the way that problem is solved is so if somebody's being creative at a mini C level, let's say they're highly creative at a mini C level, that's not equivalent to highly creative at a pro C level. Like there is a sort of continuum. So being highly creative at a mini C level is still less creative than a low pro C person. It's a bit like I don't know, like say league tables. In professional soccer, if you're top of the fourth division, that doesn't mean you're as good as the team at the top of the first division. It means more you overlap a little bit maybe with the bottom of the third division. It's sort of a continuous progression from mini C, little pro up to big C, which means somebody who's regarded as at the low end of pro C is still more creative than a child, coming up with a new way to tie their shoelaces. And so I feel it's sort of, it reconciles the issue that you described, which it doesn't mean everybody's creative. It means you can be creative at a low absolute level for yourself, but you're not. That doesn't mean that you're the same as a professional singer or a professional writer. So, I kind of I'm okay with it. I think it resolves those issues you've described, but I think at the same time you're right that it's important that we don't label everybody as creative because again that devalues real creativity. I'm big on that idea that not everybody is creative, at least not at the same level. And
yeah.
because if
So
everybody is creative, then nobody's creative. So
exactly. And that was my thing. So you've built actual instruments that let people score the creativity of a product.
mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So In doing research on creative products, one of the common ways that researchers use to assess the creativity of a product is they just get some experts and they ask those experts, just tell us on a scale from 1 to 10 how creative each of these products is. So if the experts are assessing creative stories or just creative writing, uh, some expert writers look at the stories and they just sort of off the top of their head, gut feel, they say how creative it is. Interestingly, researchers have found that they do a pretty consistent job of that. So it's actually quite a good way. If you use experts in a particular area, they're pretty good at estimating the creativity of examples of those things. But I always felt, again, being an engineer, that felt a bit too subjective to me. And I thought, I want to measure things in a more sort of objective way. So uh, I developed a scale for assessing product creativity that goes a little bit beyond the basic novelty plus effectiveness. Now, you could apply a similar sort of semi-subjective technique by, instead of asking people, just rate the overall creativity on a scale from 1 to 10. The next level is to say, rate the effectiveness on a scale from 1 to 10 and rate the novelty, and then combine those together in some way. And I kind of took that a step further by adding two other criteria. So we've already got effectiveness and novelty, and we added what we call elegance, which is more of a sort of aesthetic quality to the product, and another variable called genesis, which is more sort of paradigm breaking novelty. So it's like sort of super novelty. And the test of anything like that, though, is if you get people to assess the creativity of products using that scale, do you get the same answer as when people use, just the overall is it creative method and so on? And what we found is that you do. So the scale I developed correlates statistically with other measures of product creativity, but where it was different is that it gives you more information. So particularly, again, in engineering, if I assessed the creativity of a product, that let's say I sent a team of engineers away and I said, I want you to make me a new product, but make it creative. When they bring it back, I don't want to just say, yes, it's creative or no, it's not creative, because they'd probably say, well, why isn't it creative? What do I need to do differently to make it more creative? And that's why you need a more detailed set of criteria, because otherwise it's impossible to tell them what's wrong. It's no good saying to people, make it more creative, because they what I've found is they say, well, what does that mean? What do you want me to do differently? So the scale I developed gives you the means to actually give more specific feedback. And with this scale, if I tell them, make it more creative, and they say, what do you mean? I can say, well, it needs more elegance, or it's lacking novelty, or it's lacking effectiveness, and so we've now got 4 criteria. And on this scale, each one of those is scored in parallel. So you get a more detailed breakdown of where the creativity actually sits, which means you can give more meaningful feedback. And we've used this, for example, in schools. So if teachers are getting kids to do creative things, often, of course, in schools, the children do something, the teacher assesses it, and then the teacher says, it needs more creativity. So you've got to be able to give the kids meaningful, actionable feedback that's more than just make it more creative. And with this scale, we've used that so teachers can actually be more specific and say, it needs more of this or it needs more of this. That makes it possible for children then to understand what creativity really means, and to work on the areas that are weak and develop those further. So it was really, we developed this scale in particular, say, for engineers to use, but also for teachers to use, because it gives a more detailed description of what we mean by creativity, and it enables people to use that feedback to improve the creativity of the product.
Yes. So what you just said leads to this question, that who gets to judge? Your
Yeah.
work locates the judgment of creativity with expert readers, not with the maker. So why?
Yep. So again, very good question. I described that other technique of just rating the overall creativity and using experts. One of the problems with that is you have to have experts, and of course, sometimes it's difficult to find real experts, especially like if school teachers are doing this. They can't suddenly go out and find a professional expert artist to come and judge the children's artistic creativity. It's expensive, time consuming, and so on. So, another goal with the scale I developed is also that if you break creativity down into more criteria like novelty, effectiveness, elegance, and so on, then our hypothesis was that it's easier for anybody to judge the creativity, because if you make the criteria more explicit. And we actually tested this. So we had arts students from an arts degree, engineering students, and professional engineers all using my scale to judge the same products. And what we were able to show is that the lower, if you like, the non-expert categories of those people, for example, the arts students, they actually made judgments of creativity more like the engineering students and the professional engineers. These were, physical artifacts. So the scale achieved what we hoped, which was that it makes it possible for, let's say, not non-experts maybe, but quasi-experts. It enabled them to make judgments more like the experts, which means with this more detailed scale, you don't need to rely on experts, which is great for teachers, because if a teacher is assessing scientific creativity or artistic creativity, the teacher can use this scale. They don't need to be an expert artist or an expert engineer, and they'll still get a reliable assessment of the creativity. So part of our objective was to solve this problem that you've described, that we don't want to always have to rely on experts, because that they're difficult to find, time consuming, expensive, and it makes it harder for everyday people to kind of do their job. So we think this more detailed scale achieved that idea of breaking this link to having to have experts.
What happens if the maker thinks that his work is creative, but the judges don't?
Yeah, well, again, the actually we developed a little a smartphone app at the time that for this scale. So the idea was also that, for example, students or anybody can assess their own creativity as well. So, and again, sticking with a school example, let's say a teacher assesses a child's creativity using this scale, and the child also assesses it. That's actually a very good starting point for a conversation between the teacher and the student. So the teacher might say, I don't think your product that you've developed is very effective. The student might say, well, let's say out of 10, the teacher says, I think it was 5 out of 10, but the student says, I think it was 8 out of 10. What they can then do is have a conversation and say, well, why do we have a difference of opinion there? And that's a very useful activity for the student understanding what they might do differently, where they might improve their product to make it more creative. So I think the differences there are a good starting point for feedback, for constructive feedback, and for learning. And even an engineer or an artist using the scale on their own, they might come to the realization, actually, I see I could probably make it a bit more novel, or I could probably make it a bit more effective. So it's always this more detailed scale is intended also as a self-evaluation tool to help people understand better what creativity means, and to help them see what they could do more of to increase their creativity.
Right. Right. I think this would work in most cases. It's just perhaps in that rare human, for example, the painter Vincent van Gogh, who
Yep.
made 900 paintings in his lifetime, but sold only one. He died broke and penniless. But then after he died, he became a genius. And so it took a long time for the world to catch up to his genius. And that's why I think where we talk of creativity, it's so important to realize that it has to fit the criteria for our times. And so if somebody is too advanced, even that would not fit in the criteria of creativity because they'd just be too ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's definitely always an issue. I mean, I would argue that that's still captured, like the assessing the creativity and saying this is so novel that nobody's ever seen that before. That you could assess a product and say this is so groundbreaking, like a Van Gogh painting. This is beyond what anybody's ever seen. That's different from how society chooses to accept that or not. But you're absolutely right. The sort of two issues there. One is you can rate the creativity, and you might rate it as highly creative, but that doesn't guarantee that society will agree with you. Or even if they agree with you, they might say this is very creative, but I don't like it because we that's not the way things are done. So that's not really a problem with how we rate creativity. That's a problem with how much novelty people are willing to accept, and that's definitely an issue in creativity. Is that too much novelty can be challenging for people in
Yeah.
society, and I think it comes back to the fact that as human beings, we have a bit of a resistance to change, and of course, extreme novelty is change, and sometimes people don't like that. So, but like I said, I think that's a separate issue. You can still rate the creativity, but whether society decides that they like that or not, that's a different issue. And there are lots of examples where we see what was, with hindsight, what was clearly extreme creativity at the time, but then this conflict that society couldn't digest that and wouldn't accept it until some later point in time.
This is a little off the topic, but why do creative people so often struggle inside organizations built to scale?
Well, it's related to what we were just describing. I think that sometimes, if we turn away a little bit from the product criteria now back to the other aspects of creativity like personality and so on, we know a lot about that as well. And for example, the sorts of traits that are associated with creativity are openness to new experiences, tolerance for uncertainty, willingness to take risks, and also a strong, high ego strength, like people who are willing to do things the way they think they should be done, and so on. Quite often, these personality traits are disruptive, and there's even some research in schools that they ask teachers to identify both the traits of students that are creative, but also whether they liked those students or not. And there was this conflict that basically, to sort of simplify the result, the teachers didn't like the kids who were creative. And that's because those kids, they want to give a different answer. They want to try something different. And if you've got a class of 30 children, you don't, as a teacher, you don't want one kid saying, no, I'd like to do it differently. You want everybody to follow the instructions, do what they're told, because teachers spend a lot of their time just managing the class and so on. And it's the same in organizations sometimes, that the last thing a manager wants is some clever person who wants to do everything differently. You just want to manage things, say, just do it this way so we can all go home at 5 o'clock. And it's this fundamental issue, the same way that sometimes creative products are hard to accept because they're different and so on. Creative people sometimes are hard to accept because they behave differently and they challenge the status quo. And for a lot of people, that's annoying and a bit frightening and challenging and so on. So I think it's fundamentally the same sort of issue of disliking things that are different or changing and being a bit uncomfortable with that.
Absolutely. Let's move to dark creativity.
Yep.
You've written about creativity in crime and terrorism, IEDs, skimming schemes, deep fakes. What made you go there, and what did you discover?
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit linked to the product discussion we were having, but what first sort of got me thinking about that was actually the example of 9/11. And in the few years after 9/11, and remember, I've always been a professor of engineering as well, and I was I was at conferences and had some colleagues who, were interested in thinking, how can we use our engineering skills to help address issues associated with things like terrorism and so on. And that got me thinking about creativity. But a long story short is that, I'm not the first person who looked at this, but I realized that the advantages that creativity can give people and organizations, like developing new products, capturing a new market, and things like that, those benefits are not restricted to good people doing nice things. So if you're a criminal and you come up with a creative way of stealing money, then that's also an advantage. You can get ahead of your competition, in this case the police. But if you can, creative ideas by definition, as we've already said, are both novel, which means nobody's ever seen them before, and they're effective. So a novel way of stealing money, if nobody's ever seen it before, then it's probably going to work, or there's a good chance that it might work. It might only work once, but if you're in the business of stealing money, then being creative is the same advantage to you as it is to people making new smartphones and iPods and things like that. So I kind of was thinking about that idea, but previous to me, creativity research had looked at the idea of sort of negative and positive creativity, but the idea there was the negativity is just accidental. And where I think I changed the direction a little bit was looking at this as something very deliberate, that people can deliberately use creativity to give them an advantage in crime, terrorism, and things like that. And then it was sort of expanded on that path of basically deliberately misusing creativity rather than just the accidental misuse of creativity. And of course, then the interesting thing after that is it's not just about, looking at interesting case studies of criminal creativity, but the really important question is, can we use what we know about creativity to prevent that and to make it harder for criminals to be creative? So that's kind of how that developed.
Yeah, I've always believed too that we have to understand that if we're talking about the word creativity, we have to understand that it is morally neutral. I mean, so many of the earlier scientists and the medical people, when they were developing things, they did so many unethical things. They would take
Yeah,
slaves, test on them. It was morally, ethically so wrong. And
yeah,
yet we have to accept that all the medical advances happened because they did that. It was cruel, inhuman, but that's what it is.
yeah.
So,
I think that, the universe doesn't care whether you're doing something good or bad. Novelty is novelty, and
yeah.
effectiveness is effectiveness. So you're
Hmm.
right. There is this
Yeah.
sort of,
Yeah. There's
I mean,
a
we then,
moral neutrality, yeah,
yeah,
which,
well, and we then apply a moral label to things. And I think the history of creativity, of course, is that we've frowned on using it for bad things. So for a long time, people have associated creativity with just doing good things. But the negative, the malevolent creativity has always existed. It's
yeah,
just sort of recognizing that, you can choose to do bad things with creativity just the same as you can choose to do good things. And some people do that. So
yeah.
rather than ignoring that, we need to understand that and see, well, how can we use our knowledge of creativity to prevent that sort of thing from happening?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the things we call bad that happen in the process, but because they're hidden from the public at large. So that's why there's this idea that creativity is all good. I mean, there's a natural assumption when we talk about creativity, that as if there's an inherent goodness in that. And that's why I always urge people that really look. You may not, if you really knew the process, you may not see just the good, and that makes for a more wholesome vision of on the
Yeah.
topic.
Another challenge is that, especially with things like terrorism, but even crime, you also have to say, well, good for whom? Some people think that the terrorism acts are great because, if you're a freedom fighter trying to win independence for your country, then we might label it terrorism. They might label it trying to help your country achieve independence. So there's also that,
Yes.
it depends who you are and from what side you're looking. So it
Yes.
makes a very
Absolutely.
interesting topic of study.
Yes. Totally. Now, David, I would like to move to the topic which people are most excited about, confused about, anxious about, which is AI. You've argued that there's a mathematical calling on how creative AI can be. Can you walk us through this in simple, plain language?
Yep. So ever since generative AI appeared on the scene in late 2022, very quickly creativity researchers and other people started making claims. Some people were saying AI is really creative and therefore human creativity is at risk. Other people said, well, slow down, let's investigate this further. And it's an important question because, I mean, even before generative AI, there's always been an assumption that humans do creativity, computers can't do it. So that's always going to be a strength for us. But then along came generative AI, and some people thought there were suggestions that maybe it can challenge human creativity. And if that's the case, that's very bad news because that's the last sort of thing that we do that computers can't do. So I, of course, have been looking at this myself, and the thing that you just mentioned, again, going back to our product definition, I decided to look at large language model, generative AI creativity, but through this lens of what constitutes a creative product. So I took that definition we've been talking about, novelty and effectiveness, and again, in keeping it as sort of simple as possible, I applied that definition of creativity to a large language model to see, basically to measure the outputs of large language models in terms of that definition of product creativity. And it's actually quite easy to do because we know exactly how large language models generate outputs. It's an algorithm. It's a very sort of strictly defined process. So the long story short is that when I applied that definition of product creativity to the outputs of a large language model, I was able to show that there is a mathematical upper limit to the large language model output creativity. And not just that, but that upper limit corresponds to roughly average human creativity. And I've been able to show, so that was a theory. Now, any theory, the test of a good theory is, can you find real world evidence? So I then went looking to see, does my prediction that large language model creativity has an upper limit of human average creativity, could I find any evidence to support that? In fact, I found a lot of evidence from other studies of generative AI creativity. So the simple explanation is that I think I can show mathematically that large language models can only be about as creative as an average human. And that's good news for human creativity because it means that it's true for some people, large language models can help some people be more creative. Basically, the people who are below average, little c, mini c creative, it can help pull them up to the human average. But the people who are already professional level, pro C or big C creative, who are already above the human average, they don't really get the same benefit from large language models. And it makes sense why. If large language models are trained on this vast array of human information, then the analogy I always give is that if you tip everything into a swimming pool, like if you take buckets of hot water, buckets of cold water, you put it in a swimming pool, you stir it all together, and you scoop out a cup of water, what temperature is that water going to be? It's going to be at the average. You will never scoop out a cup of boiling water. You'll never scoop out a cup of freezing water, even if those went into the pool. And that's the same as large language models. Everything is put in there, all the human outputs, stirred together. So it's no surprise that what comes out of that is average. And that's exactly what my mathematical proof has shown with respect to large language model creativity. Is it's all stirred together, and what it spits out at the best is average human creativity. that's important because it still means that for above average human creative people, especially professional level and big C creative people, writers, artists, engineers, whatever, there is still a vital need and a vital role for those above average creative people. And just using a large language model doesn't help make everybody super creative. It lifts below average people, but it may well drag down higher creativity people. So we've got to be very careful about how we use it. But like I said, I think it's basically good news for human
Absolutely.
creativity.
When first AI came, there was this general idea that the fields that would face the heat would might be, the scientific, mathematical fields. But in fact, the opposite happened. It was the more human fields of artists, of musicians. I find people keep sending me AI music, and I get conned because initially it sounds nice. It sounds quite amazing. It sounds absolutely perfect because it's missing all the human imperfections. And I was asking that, oh, who's the singer? But the strange thing followed, and that was as soon as they said, oh, this is created by I just lost interest. I didn't feel like listening to that anymore. So
Yeah.
this is something that, I'm just wondering how and where is this really going to go?
I think, I mean, with something like music, there'll be a bit of interest, but I think quickly people think, yeah, you know what, I'd much rather listen to whoever, my favorite human artist, because I like knowing that a person had to think up that guitar
Mhm.
riff. I like hearing, the slight imperfections in their voice. I like hearing a bit of emotion in their voice and those sorts of things. I'll give you another example. My eldest son is the as a writer for a video game company in Germany, and he's the lead writer for a new video game. And so I had lots of conversations with him about generative AI, and he said they've tried to use generative AI, as part of their process, but he said it's not good enough because he said if he and his colleagues are professional writers, he said I can do much better than that. It comes up with generic, boring stuff, and he says it's just not good enough if you're a professional level writer. So they quickly looked at it and said, no, it's not doesn't do the job. I mean, if you want a generic, boring sort of variation of a story that we've heard 100 times, okay, you can generate that quickly. But if you're trying to make a world leading new video game that excites the people who play it and tells an interesting story, the large language models just aren't good enough because they're good at they can generate very quickly plausible, okay, average stuff. So if all you're looking for is average and you want it quickly, then sure. But human beings still value high creativity. They still value things that surprise them that they've never heard of before and that sort of thing. So
Absolutely. That's the most profound thing. And perhaps that's the reason why we don't have to fear AI, at least not at this point. I mean, if it keeps improving, I don't know where it's going to go. But finally, it's always going to move and spin in the realm of whatever has already been created. And
yeah.
if by chance, if it ends up mixing a few ideas, and that automatically created something new, that wouldn't fall in the definition of creativity itself, because creativity says that you have to be deliberate about it. If I accidentally spilled some colors on a canvas and that turned out just well by chance, that's not considered creative. So,
Yeah. Yeah. But even with the sort of accidentally version, I don't
yeah,
think that, AI is going to accidentally you know, come up
yeah.
with. I mean, another example. So people sometimes say to me, but David, here's an example where AI was creative. And every time I see that, if you drill a bit deeper, you find that humans were involved. And so an example I've sometimes used is I say to people, like with respect to painting pictures, the only thing that the AI does for me is saves me the trouble of having to learn how to paint. But I mean, to make an interesting picture on AI, it's a human idea, that goes into that, and all the AI is doing is sort of putting the paint on canvas. But that's the easy technical bit. The tricky bit is the clever idea that's creative, and that's still every example I've looked at. If it's creative, it's always because a human was involved, and basically they came up with a creative idea. All the AI did was put the paint on the canvas, so to speak.
Yes. And I think that that's exactly what it is. That for somebody who's at a high level, they would actually use AI just as a tool and not make AI the master, that you do
Yeah,
all the thinking, all the planning. I'm just inferior. I can't think for myself. You do everything for me. So that's where it's a misuse of AI. I think it wasn't even created to be used in that way. So,
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I find one potential useful aspect of it is to get all the average ideas out of the way. If you're trying to come up with new ideas, because we know from research on things like brainstorming that it takes time to, you have a phase at the beginning where you get all the bad ideas, and it's only after a little while that you start to get to the good ideas. So AI, for example, can get all the bad ideas out of the way more quickly so that
yes.
humans can then get on with the good stuff.
Also, you've spoken about assessment and gifted education. You've spent decades working on how to assess creativity in students. What does the schooling system miss about creative children or about creativity?
Well, it's challenging. I mentioned earlier that one of the challenges is that when children actually behave creatively, sometimes that's problematic for teachers. And it's not that teachers are bad people. It's, as I said before, that if you're trying to manage a class full of 30 kids of different abilities, it's very hard to give each child, the unique tailored attention that they need. And you're trying to get everybody to sort of behave themselves and do the same thing. So, but teachers and schools that I've worked with, I think, understand very well what creativity is. All of the schools that I've ever set foot in and had discussions on this about understand the importance of creativity and so on. The biggest challenge they face is the resources and the time, and also sometimes need some help in understanding how to build creativity into different subjects. I
Mhm.
see this problem even at university. I've had conversations with my colleagues in the engineering department, and even they sort of understand that creativity, it's about problem solving. That's what engineers do. So they understand it's important. But then the best that you can get out of them is, say, 1 hour, in the last week of a semester to do a bit of creativity. And I said that's not good enough. You can't just have a creativity module and sort of tick that box in people's heads. It needs to be a part of everything that the students do. And
Completely.
that's possible to do, but it takes more time and effort. Same in schools. You can build creativity into mathematics, into the biology, as well as into art and music and so on. But it takes time and effort. It means redeveloping the curriculum. That's the biggest challenge. And
That's,
one
yes.
final point there is that the other pressure that schools and universities face is, of course, that parents, like a lot of parents, they just want to make sure their kid gets a high, in the US, a high SAT score, the
Yes.
equivalent here, and they get into a good university program. And so they don't want the schools doing anything that they think might be detracting from their child's, getting a good score to get into university. And often, unfortunately, creativity is seen as some, airy fairy thing that's not
Yeah.
part of the core curriculum.
No, that's completely the problem with the education system, that it's just about memorization, that somebody wrote a book, explained something, and everybody now just has to learn that, memorize it, and the better memorizer wins the game or, gets the marks. And the
Yeah.
one who is trying to think something different, or if this learning sparks an idea, and if he chooses to develop something, that would get pulled down. It could even actually be questioning what he's learning. But our education system doesn't respect or value that.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
the most unfortunate thing.
Uh, I actually had a conversation a few years ago with one. So in Australia, we've got a fairly sort of evenly split education system at schools of state-funded schools and then private schools, and roughly sort of equal proportion. So a lot of private schools. I had a conversation with one private school here initially who they were interested in creativity and so on. And then after about 3 months, they came back to me and said, we've been discussing this internally and so on, and we've decided not to proceed with anything about creativity. And the words they said to me is, because we don't want to do anything to disrupt our current success formula. And I realized that meant that even that school sees they're a factory for getting children to get a high score to get into university. And they don't want to do anything that might, and especially as a private school, they know that the parents are paying the school to get their kid into a good degree at university. Anything else that risks interfering with that is a bad thing. And I thought that's just mind blowing, because
It's terrible.
they're
It's
but
pathetic,
that's it,
actually. And that's the world. That's the world we're living in, unfortunately. And I think it's really, voices that are willing to stand up and actually say the truth for what it is. Hopefully, that can really start changing the thinking of everybody, not just
yeah,
the intellectuals or the policymakers, but as you said, the parents. I think that
yeah,
they need to start demanding this as well. If they really
yeah.
want their children to be equipped for especially the AI future, it's really essential to think about this
Exactly.
now.
That's the whole,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
future of work is,
yeah,
we know is with more and more automation, it means the more valuable skills now are soft skills like creativity. And if you're not preparing kids for that, then you may not see any effect now, but in 10 years' time, those kids, when they're 10 years old, they may find they can't get a job because they're
sad.
very good at mathematics, but computers do maths now, or they're very good at this.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I keep shouting this from the rooftops, and nobody's paying attention. So
yeah, 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 totally. So, you belong to, I think that you just spoke about your son. So I'm guessing that your entire family is creative. I mean, your father, Arthur Cropley, was, one of the leaders in this field. Could you talk a little bit about your family background? Because it seems everyone is steeped in creativity, and
yeah,
it'd be
well,
interesting to
I'm
know.
yeah, no, it's I mean, certainly my children, like I'm the odd person out in my family. My wife, I think, is quite creative and does sort of some art and a bit of acting and so on. All three of my children have been involved in the arts. I'm the engineer, but it's very interesting for me to observe them. So I mentioned my eldest son. He lives in Germany. He's a professional writer, works for a video game company. My daughter, in the middle child, she's been living in London for the last few years, but she's a sort of fledgling screenwriter. So she's trying to she has a very interesting screenplay now that she's trying to get people interested in for a horror movie.
Oh,
And my youngest son is an actor. He lives in Los Angeles, and he's a professional actor. He's been in a number of these vertical dramas now that are becoming very popular, and short films, and he has quite a large presence on TikTok, making his own sketches. So he's sort of working and living as a professional actor. But all of the kids have done art and sort of extracurricular acting and so on since they were young children. So it's been very interesting to watch that as a relative kind of outsider to that, but also as a creativity researcher. And in fact, I in a sort of roundabout way, through their acting teacher many years ago, I've been in a couple of TV shows as a background actor. And that
oh,
was
nice.
especially interesting because as a creativity researcher, I went into that thinking, this is going to be chaotic. These actors, they don't know what they're doing. They just, turn up whenever they feel like and do anything. But it was a much more structured process.
Mm,
And looking at it through a lens of creativity, I could see like there are multiple little creative problem solving processes happening here with the director, with the assistant director, even with individual pairs of background actors, all engaged in little creative problem solving processes. And it was really fascinating for me. So I've been very lucky to be able
Yeah.
to sort of have a bit of insight into these artistic processes through my family.
And how about your father? Was that why you were drawn to creativity?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm an engineer by training, and about 30 years ago, so 6 or 7 years into my academic career, almost by accident, my father and I collaborated on a little study looking at a creativity test with engineering students. And this came about, I was just given the task of developing a new undergraduate course that had some creativity in it. And I thought, well, I know a creativity researcher, my father, so I went and talked to him, and it kind of developed from there. And the more I did, the more interesting I thought it was. That's, as an engineer, was interested in the product aspect of creativity, of course, but also educational aspects. So we've collaborated for about 30 years, and of course his background is he was a school teacher in Australia and England and Canada, and for a few years, and then went back to university to study creativity. So he's been a creativity researcher since before I was born. And of course, I always knew this, but it wasn't until I was about 30 years old that our our interests kind of
Mhm.
intersected, and we started collaborating together. So I was very lucky because not being a creativity researcher by training, it kind of meant that I had this sort of private tuition in creativity researcher by creativity research by collaborating with him, and it developed. And after a few years, I thought this is much more interesting than the engineering stuff I'm doing, so I kind of focused on the creativity research.
So, as a parting note, David, I was wondering that somebody who is looking at aligning themselves with creativity, would you have some suggestions from both, irrespective of whether they're practitioners or whether they're academics interested in studying creativity? What could you give as some tips or some starting points?
Yeah. Well, the first I think is to remember that there is a science of creativity, and I often see, for example, scientific papers coming from other disciplines, and it's obviously a new person who's looking at creativity for the first time, and often they begin by saying things like nobody really knows what creativity is, or creativity is confusing and complex. That's not true. There is a very good, solid science of creativity. So my first recommendation is, if you're interested in creativity, realize that there is a solid science, a solid foundation. Go and read up on that. And the way to find that is basically creativity research developed in the field of educational psychology. So, but you'll find lots of good introductory academic books and papers. The single biggest tip is, if somebody from whatever discipline they're in thinks I'm quite interested in creativity, then step one is understand there is a science of creativity. Go and do some background work so you're not kind of repeating myths or making assumptions that have already been addressed. And as soon as people read up a bit on the background, the science of creativity, they'll then be able to make much quicker progress, because they can take, everything we already know, the ways of measuring creativity, all these sorts of things, and instead of, relearning those basic
Reinventing the wheel.
reinventing the wheel, they can take that stuff and apply it straight away. So that's probably the biggest recommendation: is don't fall into this trap of thinking that we don't know what creativity is. We do. There's a lot of research. There's a science of creativity. So read up on that, and then you can make more rapid progress.
Yes, that's so useful what you just said now, because most people, when they step into creativity, they think they need to figure out everything from scratch. And there's really this understanding in people that there's nothing there, whereas there's actually so much already
Yeah.
done. And so that really thanks a lot for clarifying that.
The other small thing I'd say is also that if you're going to do creativity research, you're probably going to have to do statistics. So I mean, even with my own PhD students, I say, if you haven't done any statistics before, that's the other thing. Go and read a statistics book, because you can't avoid that too much. So that's the other, and especially like if people come from a disciplinary background where they haven't studied statistics, you're going to have to learn some statistics as well. So
Well, thank you. Thank you for really those valuable tips. David, this has been a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed listening to all your thoughts. There was so much of enlightening information and such interesting perspectives on this
well, thank
most
you.
elusive topic of creativity. So really enjoyed having you on the Creativity Dialogues. Thank you so much for being with
Thank you.
us today.
It's been great talking to you, and thank you for your very interesting and perceptive questions. I love doing things like this because I always think of new things myself, talking to other people who have an interest in creativity but come from a different background. There's lots of good cross fertilization as well. So
Yes. Thanks again.